What if you were handed over at the altar to a man who wasn't yours, in place of the sister who ran away? Sophie felt her world collapse when Daniel Blake's cold eyes devoured her from beneath the veil. He knew. And yet, he pulled her close, his breath burning against her skin. You think I didn't notice the switch? But what neither of them expected was that this forced marriage would hide a forbidden desire, capable of setting everything ablaze. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, also click the Super Thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing stories that move you. The church was suffocatingly silent. The kind of silence that comes before storms, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your muscles tense involuntarily. Sophie Miller felt every fiber of the wedding dress, which wasn't hers, brush against her skin like a condemnation. The silk fabric weighed heavy on her shoulders, the bodice too tight, suffocating not just her body, but any illusion that this could end well. The sweet perfume of white flowers adorning the church pews mixed with the strong smell of candle wax and her own cold sweat. She could taste the metallic tang of fear in her mouth. Beneath the thick veil, hand-embroidered with tiny pearls that reflected the golden candlelight, Sophie tried to control her breathing. Each breath was a conscious effort. Breathe in, breathe out. Don't faint. Don't run. But how could she run when her own father stood beside her, his hand firm, controlling, gripping her arm as if she were a prisoner being led to the gallows? Richard Miller, her father, was a ruthless businessman. To him, daughters were assets, chess pieces. And that morning, when Emma, the golden daughter, the original bride, disappeared, leaving only a scribbled, tear-stained note, Richard didn't hesitate. He entered Sophie's room, still dark before dawn, and said in a voice as sharp as shattered glass, "Put on the dress. You're marrying in her place. Don't disappoint me like your sister did." There was no request, no explanation, just an order. And Sophie, who had spent her entire life trying to be invisible, trying not to cause trouble, trying to be good enough to deserve the love she never received, obeyed. She always obeyed. Now, standing before the altar, Sophie felt the weight of hundreds of stares upon her. Distinguished guests, businessmen, renowned doctors, high society figures, whispered among themselves. She couldn't hear the words, but she felt the malice, the morbid curiosity, the scandal being savored like expensive wine. They know. Everyone knows. And then her eyes met his. Daniel Blake, CEO of one of the country's largest medical empires, 35 years old, tall and imposing, broad shoulders beneath an impeccably tailored tuxedo, dark hair combed back with almost surgical precision, strong jawline marked by a light shadow of stubble that suggested controlled masculinity. But it was his eyes, grey like tempered steel, cold as ice, that pierced through her in that moment. He stood before the altar, rigid, hands clenched at his sides. There was no kindness in that sculpted face, no forgiveness. There was contained fury, poorly disguised humiliation, and something else. Something that made Sophie's stomach turn. Desire. No. She must be imagining it. How could there be desire amid so much hatred? The priest, an elderly man with a trembling voice, began the ceremony with obvious hesitation. The words seemed to echo through the vastness of the church like accusations. Sophie could barely hear them. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears it drowned everything out. Her hands, hidden beneath the bouquet of white lilies, flowers Emma had chosen, trembled uncontrollably. That's when Daniel moved. He took a step toward her, breaking protocol, ignoring the priest who stuttered and stopped mid-sentence. The sound of Daniel's Italian shoes echoed on the marble like a verdict. He stopped so close that Sophie could feel the heat emanating from his body, could smell his expensive cologne. Notes of wood and spices, something deep and masculine that made her legs weaken. Then, with a movement that made Sophie's blood freeze and boil at the same time, Daniel raised his hand and, with fingers firm yet surprisingly gentle, lifted the veil covering her face. The candlelight bathed her now exposed face. Sophie felt her skin burn under the scrutiny of those grey eyes that devoured her, analyzed her, dissected her. She saw the exact moment confirmation hit him. Not Emma, The other one. The forgotten sister. Daniel's jaw tightened. A vein pulsed visibly at his temple. He leaned in, bringing his face close until his lips brushed the shell of Sophie's ear. His breath, hot, controlled, dangerous, touched the sensitive skin of her neck, provoking shivers that ran down her spine. "Do you really think I'm an idiot?" His voice was a hoarse whisper, low enough that only she could hear, but charged with an intensity that made each word pierce like a sharp blade. "That I wouldn't notice the switch." Sophie swallowed hard. Her throat was so dry it hurt. She wanted to respond, wanted to defend herself, wanted to scream that this wasn't her choice, but the words died before they were born. Daniel pulled back slightly, just enough to look into her eyes, and Sophie, for the first time in her life, didn't look away. She faced him, saw the anger, saw the betrayal, saw the humiliation of a proud man being made a fool before all of society. But she also saw something else, something that frightened her more than the anger. Hunger. His eyes dropped briefly to her lips. It was quick, a fraction of a second one, but Sophie felt it, felt as if he had touched her, felt the heat rise through her face, her neck, spread across her chest like liquid fire. "Continue with the ceremony." Daniel ordered the priest without taking his eyes off Sophie. His voice echoed through the church, firm, unwavering, a declaration of absolute control. The priest, visibly relieved to have permission to proceed, resumed the ritual words with a stronger voice. But Sophie barely heard. She was trapped, trapped in Daniel's eyes, trapped in his suffocating proximity, trapped in the disturbing sensation that despite everything, despite the anger and hatred and scandal, there was an electric current between them that couldn't be ignored. When it came time for the vows, Daniel took her hand. His fingers were warm, firm, enveloping hers with a pressure that was both possessive and strangely comforting. Sophie looked at their intertwined hands, his large, masculine, with veins visible beneath bronzed skin, hers small, pale, visibly trembling. "I do." Daniel's voice cut through the silence like a blade. All eyes turned to Sophie. She opened her mouth. No sound came out. Daniel squeezed her hand, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to anchor her, to pull her back from the edge of panic. I do," Sophie finally whispered, and with those two words, her fate was sealed. The priest pronounced them husband and wife. The church erupted in polite applause, but Sophie knew they were applauding out of curiosity, not celebration. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Everyone wanted to witness the fall. Daniel leaned in again. For one terrible and wonderful moment, Sophie thought he was going to kiss her. His lips were inches from hers. She could feel his breath mingling with her own, could see the nuances of grey in his eyes, layers of storm and ice and something deeper she couldn't name. But he didn't kiss her. Instead, his lips brushed lightly against her cheekbone, a phantom touch that left her skin burning. "Welcome to hell, Sophie Miller," he murmured against her skin. "Or should I say, Sophie Blake?" And then he pulled away, offering his arm with an icy courtesy that contrasted brutally with the intimacy of the previous moment. Sophie took his arm, feeling the tense muscles beneath the tuxedo fabric. Together, they walked down the church aisle as the organ played the wedding march. The doors opened, revealing a grey and threatening sky. Outside, it began to rain. The Blake mansion rose imposingly against the clouded sky like a fortress of stone and glass. Sophie watched the structure through the fogged limousine window, feeling a cold settle into her bones that had nothing to do with the temperature. The property was vast. Meticulously maintained gardens, marble fountains, a circular driveway with Portuguese stone, forming hypnotic geometric patterns. Everything was perfect. Everything was cold. Everything screamed money, power, and emotional distance. Daniel hadn't said a single word during the entire drive from the church. He had remained seated beside her, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on his phone screen where emails and messages piled up. Sophie could feel the tension emanating from him in almost palpable waves. With each notification that arrived, she saw his jaw tighten slightly. "They're talking about us, about the scandal, about the switch." When the limousine finally stopped in front of the main entrance, a grey-haired butler with impeccable posture opened the door. Daniel got out first, adjusting his shirt cuffs with precise, almost mechanical movements. Then, without looking at Sophie, he extended his hand to help her out. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before accepting. The moment her fingers touched his, an electric current ran up her arm. Daniel felt it too. She saw it in his eyes, in the way his pupils briefly dilated before he regained his iron control. "Welcome to your new home, Mrs. Blake." His voice was formal, distant, but there was a sharp edge that made each word sound like a veiled accusation. Sophie withdrew her hand as soon as her feet touched the ground, immediately feeling the absence of his warmth. The wedding dress, heavy, sumptuous, a prison of silk and lace, dragged across the floor as she climbed the marble steps. Each step echoed like a countdown. The mansion's interior was even more impressive and intimidating. The entrance hall had a double-height ceiling. A gigantic crystal chandelier hung from above like a waterfall of light, and the Italian marble floor reflected everything like a polished mirror. The walls were adorned with contemporary art, pieces Sophie recognized from famous auctions, million-dollar investments transformed into decoration. "Margaret will show you to your quarters," Daniel announced, gesturing to a middle-aged woman dressed in a discreet but elegant uniform. She had kind eyes, a stark contrast to the coldness of the environment. "My quarters," Sophie repeated, her voice coming out softer than intended. "We're not going to share." Daniel finally looked at her. Really looked. His eyes traveled slowly across her face, down her neck, over the exposed shoulders of the dress, before returning to meet her eyes. There was something predatory in that gaze, something that made Sophie's heart race in a way she couldn't control. "Do you actually believe this is a real marriage, Sophie?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "You're here for convenience, to save your family's image and protect mine. Nothing more." Each word was a stab. Sophie felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but forced herself to keep her head high. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Blake," she replied, putting as much coldness into her voice as she could muster. Something passed through his eyes. Surprise, approval, anger. Sophie couldn't identify it before Daniel turned and walked toward what appeared to be his office, leaving her alone in the vast, cold hall. Margaret approached with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Come, dear. I'll show you your room. I'm sure you're exhausted." The room Margaret revealed was spectacular and lonely. Located in the east wing of the mansion, it was a complete suite with a walk-in closet, marble bathroom with a Victorian tub, and a balcony overlooking the gardens. The king-size bed dominated the space. Covered with Egyptian linen sheets in cream and silver tones, everything was luxurious, everything was impersonal. "Mr. Blake's room is in the opposite wing," Margaret explained gently, noticing Sophie's gaze wandering toward the door. "He values his privacy." Privacy. What a pretty word for loneliness. After Margaret left, Sophie stood in the center of the enormous room, still wearing the wedding dress that now seemed to weigh tons. She looked at her own reflection in the full-length mirror, a woman she barely recognized. Her brown hair was pinned in an elaborate updo that Emma had planned. The makeup, done hastily by a professional who tried to disguise the panic in Sophie's eyes, was beginning to smudge. And the dress, the damn dress that was never hers. With trembling fingers, Sophie began struggling with the tiny buttons on the back. There were dozens of them, impossible to reach alone. Tears of frustration stung her eyes as she twisted her arms, managing to unbutton only a few before giving up, breathless. A soft knock on the door made her freeze. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Margaret returning. But it was Daniel who entered. He had removed his tuxedo jacket and loosened his tie. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms with defined muscles and a light layer of dark hair. He held a glass of whiskey. The amber liquid glowed under the soft light of the chandelier. Sophie instinctively crossed her arms over her chest, as if that could protect her from his intense gaze. "I forgot to mention something," Daniel said, his voice hoarse in a way that did strange things to Sophie's stomach. He took a slow sip of the whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. "There will be events, charity dinners, corporate parties. You'll need to attend by my side. Smile. Act like a devoted wife." "I understand," Sophie replied, hating how small her voice sounded in that enormous room. Daniel began walking toward her, measured, deliberate steps. Sophie felt her heart race. She wanted to back away, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. He stopped just inches from her, so close that Sophie could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the small golden flecks in his grey eyes, could count every dark strand in his lashes. "Turn around," he ordered softly. "What?" Sophie blinked, confused. "The buttons. You won't be able to reach them on your own." There was something different in his voice now, something softer, almost gentle. Sophie hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to maintain distance, to not let him so close. But she was trapped in that dress, and the idea of sleeping with it squeezing her ribs was unbearable. Slowly she turned, giving him her back. The silence that followed was so thick that Sophie could hear her own heart beating in her ears. Then she felt it. His fingers lightly touching the nape of her neck, moving a loose strand of hair aside. The touch was surprisingly gentle, almost reverent. Daniel began unbuttoning the dress, one button at a time. His fingers brushed against Sophie's exposed skin with each movement, provoking shivers she couldn't control. She bit her lower lip, trying desperately to ignore the sensation of heat spreading through her body. "Your father is a cruel man," Daniel murmured suddenly, his voice so low Sophie almost didn't hear. "Forcing you to do this." Sophie closed her eyes tightly. "And you, what are you for accepting it?" She felt his fingers stop for a moment. Then he continued, slower now. "Someone who can't afford to look weak," he replied, and there was a raw honesty in those words that surprised Sophie. When the last button came undone, the dress loosened, falling slightly from Sophie's shoulders. She quickly held the fabric against her chest, turning her face slightly to look at Daniel over her shoulder. He was looking at her, not at the falling dress, at her eyes. "Good night, Sophie," he said, his voice hoarse in a way that made something tighten in her chest. Then he left, closing the door softly behind him. Sophie stood there alone, holding the dress, the scent of his cologne still in the air, feeling her skin tingle where his fingers had touched. And for the first time since everything began, she wondered if this marriage of convenience could become something much more dangerous, something she wouldn't know how to control. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding. 3 weeks of loaded silences, of furtive glances through empty hallways, of formal dinners where silver utensils touched porcelain with sounds that echoed like accusations. Sophie had become a shadow in that immense mansion, present but invisible. Daniel left early for the hospital and returned late, always with a furrowed brow, always with that distant look of someone carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But there were moments. Small moments that Sophie secretly kept like forbidden treasures. The way Daniel would pause when passing her in the hallway, as if wanting to say something, but never did. The way his eyes followed her when she walked through the gardens at dusk, thinking he wasn't watching. The electric tension that took over the air when by chance their hands touched, while reaching for the same object during dinner. On that particular night, Sophie was in the library, her favorite refuge in the mansion. It was a vast room with mahogany shelves that went from floor to ceiling, sliding bronze ladders, leather armchairs that smelled of tobacco and thyme. The rain had started at nightfall, first as a gentle drizzle, then transforming into a violent storm that made the windows rattle. Sophie loved storms. She always had. There was something comforting about nature's organized chaos, the way lightning tore through the sky and thunder rumbled like the earth's heart beating. She was barefoot, wearing only a simple light blue cotton dress that Margaret had left for her hair loose falling in waves over her shoulders. In her hands, she held an old poetry book she had found, pages yellowed by time, smelling of mold and secrets. The lights began to flicker. Sophie looked up just as everything plunged into darkness. The storm had knocked out the power. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from a strange excitement. There was something liberating about the darkness, as if the masks everyone wore during the day could finally fall. She stood still, letting her eyes adjust, hearing only the rain hammering the windows and her own breathing. Then she heard footsteps. "Sophie!" Daniel's voice cut through the darkness, coming from the library door. "I'm here," she replied, her voice sounding calmer than she felt. A faint light appeared. Daniel was holding an oil lamp, the old-fashioned kind Margaret kept for emergencies. The flame danced, casting shadows that played across his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw, the strong line of his nose, the intensity of eyes that now seemed even darker. He wore only black tailored pants and a white shirt, with the first buttons open, sleeves casually rolled up. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it repeatedly. There was something different about him that night, something less controlled, more human. "Are you okay?" he asked, entering the library and closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking in the silence did strange things to Sophie's stomach. "Yes, I like storms," she admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. Daniel watched her for a long moment, the flickering lamplight dancing between them. "You're strange, you know that." It wasn't an insult. There was something almost curious in his voice, almost affectionate. "Strange how?" Sophie tilted her head, gently challenging him. "Most women I know would be afraid, or at least pretend to be afraid to get attention." He walked closer, placing the lamp on the reading table. The golden light bathed them both now, creating a bubble of intimacy in the middle of the darkness. "But you stay here, alone, reading poetry in the dark." Sophie felt her cheeks warm. "Maybe I like solitude, or maybe you're too used to it," Daniel replied gently, and there was an understanding in those words that made Sophie's heart tighten. A silence settled between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, electric, like the air before lightning strikes. "The storm knocked out the basement generator," Daniel finally said, breaking the moment. "I need to check it. There's another lamp down there. Do you want to come with me?" It was a strange invitation. Unnecessary. He could easily go alone, but there was something in the way he asked, hesitant, almost vulnerable, that made Sophie agree. Yes. The Blake Mansion's basement was surprisingly welcoming for an underground space. It had high ceilings, exposed brick walls, shelves organized with rare wines and carefully stored equipment. The generator was in a separate room in the back. Daniel went ahead, holding the lamp high to light the way. Sophie followed closely, very aware of his every movement, the way the muscles in his back moved beneath his shirt, his scent, that mix of expensive cologne and something more essential, more masculine. When they reached the generator room, Daniel placed the lamp on a shelf and began examining the equipment. Sophie stood watching his hands work, confident, competent, long fingers manipulating wires and buttons with the same precision he probably used in surgeries. "How you know how to fix generators?" she asked, genuinely curious. "My father taught me," Daniel replied without looking at her. He believed a man should know how to do everything himself, not depend on anyone. There was something in his voice, an old hurt, a scar that had never completely healed. "He sounds like he was a difficult man," Sophie said softly. Daniel finally looked at her, and the vulnerability in that look hit her like a punch. He was. But he also made me who I am today, for better or worse. Sophie took a step toward him. She didn't plan it. Her body simply moved, drawn by that rare openness, by that moment of honesty. "I think," she began, her voice low, "that you're more than what he made you." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. He straightened up, abandoning the generator, turning completely to face her. The distance between them was small now, maybe a meter, maybe less. "And what do you think I am, Sophie?" he asked, his voice hoarse, dangerous. Sophie swallowed hard. Her heart was beating so loud she was sure he could hear it. "I think you're someone who had to build walls so high that now you don't know how to tear them down anymore." Something crossed Daniel's face. Pain, recognition, desire. He took a step toward her, then another, until there was no more space between them, until Sophie could feel the heat emanating from his body like a wave, until she could see every detail of those grey eyes, stormy, vulnerable, hungry. "Do you always smell like this?" Daniel murmured, his voice so low it was almost a growl. "Like what?" Sophie could barely whisper, her breath caught in her throat. "Like lavender, and something that drives me crazy." He raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted. But Sophie didn't pull back. His fingers touched her face, a touch so gentle it was almost reverent. He traced the line of her cheekbone, descended along her jaw, brushed his thumb over her lower lip. Sophie trembled, her eyes closing involuntarily at the touch. "Look at me," Daniel ordered softly. She obeyed, opened her eyes and met his. Dark, intense, completely focused on her, as if she were the only thing that existed in the entire universe. "I shouldn't want you," he confessed, his voice loaded with conflict. "You're here because of someone else, out of convenience, out of obligation." "I know," Sophie whispered, "but I do." Daniel continued, bringing his face close until their breaths mingled. "God help me, I've wanted you since the moment I lifted that veil and saw your eyes." And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't hesitant, it was pure hunger. His lips captured hers with an intensity that stole all the air from Sophie's lungs. One of his hands held the nape of her neck, fingers burying themselves in her hair, tilting her face to deepen the kiss. The other hand pulled her waist, pressing their bodies together until there wasn't a millimeter of space between them. Sophie gasped against his mouth, and Daniel took advantage to deepen the kiss even more, his tongue meeting hers in a dance that was both new and strangely familiar. She grabbed his shirt, crumpling the fabric between her fingers, needing something to anchor herself while the world spun out of control. The kiss was everything. Anger and desire, frustration and relief, weeks of tension finally exploding into flames. Sophie could feel his heart beating against hers, accelerated, uncontrolled. Could feel his strength, the way his muscles were tense, as if he were holding back from completely devouring her. When they finally separated, breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against hers, his eyes still closed, his breathing irregular. "That was—" he began. "I know," Sophie whispered, but before they could say anything else, the lights came back on. The electricity returned with a sudden hum, bathing the basement in artificial light that seemed too aggressive after the intimacy of the dim lighting. Daniel pulled back as if he'd been burned, running his hands through his hair, turning away from her. "This can't happen again," he said, his voice hard again, the walls being rebuilt brick by brick. Sophie felt her chest tighten, but forced herself to speak. "Why not?" "Because it wouldn't change anything," Daniel replied, finally looking at her, and there was so much conflict in those eyes it hurt. "We'd still be two people trapped in a marriage neither of us chose." And with that, he left the basement, leaving Sophie alone with the taste of him still on her lips and her heart shattered. But something had changed, irreversibly, and they both knew it. The days following the kiss in the basement were silent torture. Sophie felt like she was walking on shattered glass, every movement calculated, every breath measured, every glance loaded with something unspoken that pulsed between her and Daniel, like a heart split in two. He didn't talk about that night. He acted as if nothing had happened, but Sophie knew it was a lie. She saw it in the way he hesitated when entering a room where she was, saw it in the way his eyes searched for her during dinner, traveling across her face, down her neck, before he forced himself to look away. Saw it in the tension in his shoulders, in the way his fingers tightened around his wine glass until his knuckles turned white. Daniel Blake was running, but Sophie was tired of being invisible. She began doing small things, nothing obvious, nothing that could be called direct provocation, but things she knew he would notice. She started wearing lighter dresses during breakfast, nothing indecent, just fabrics that floated when she walked, that adjusted gently over her body's curves. She left her hair down more often, the brown waves falling over her bare shoulders. She began using a different perfume, something more intense with notes of jasmine and vanilla that left a subtle trail wherever she went. And it worked. Oh, how it worked. Sophie noticed the way Daniel's eyes narrowed when she entered the room, how his jaw tightened when she passed too close, when her perfume enveloped him, how he held his breath when, by accident, or perhaps not so accidentally, she brushed his arm while reaching for her coffee cup. One particular morning, Sophie was in the back garden. It was a space she had claimed as her own, a small paradise of white roses, purple lavender, and jasmine that perfumed the air with an almost intoxicating sweetness. She wore a simple beige linen dress, light enough for the morning breeze to make the fabric dance against her legs. She was barefoot, her feet sinking slightly into the grass, still damp with dew, a hose in her hand watering the flowers. The morning sun bathed everything in golden tones. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to simply feel the warmth on her face, the smell of flowers, the sound of water falling gently on the petals. "You should wear a hat. The sun is strong." Daniel's voice made her jump. Sophie turned quickly, her heart racing, and found him standing on the veranda overlooking the garden. He was leaning against the wooden railing, arms crossed over his chest, wearing dark grey dress pants and a white shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows. But what stole the air from Sophie's lungs was his look. Hunger. Pure and shameless. Daniel's eyes travelled slowly over her body, so slowly that Sophie felt as if he were touching her. He started at her bare feet, moved up her bare legs to where the dress began just below her knees, lingered at her waist, marked by the slightly tight fabric, rose to her neckline where a slight sheen of sweat formed in the sun's heat, passed over her parted lips, until finally meeting her eyes. Sophie felt her legs weaken. The hose slipped slightly in her hand, making water splash on the ground. "I like the sun," she finally managed to respond, her voice coming out huskier than intended. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He just kept looking, and there was something different in that look today. Something less contained, less controlled. "You're too beautiful for all this silence," he finally said, his voice so low Sophie almost didn't hear. Before she could respond, before she could even process those words, Daniel went back inside the house, leaving her alone with her heart beating wildly and her skin burning where his gaze had touched. Sad that night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay in the enormous bed, the silk sheets too cold against her heated skin, her mind spinning in infinite circles. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face, heard his voice saying those words. "You're too beautiful for all this silence." What did that mean? Was it a confession, a desire, or just a cruel observation about something that could never exist between them? Sophie got up, unable to bear another minute lying down. She put on a silk robe over her thin nightgown and left the room, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She had no destination in mind. She just needed to move, needed to do something besides think. She ended up in the kitchen, a huge professional space with granite countertops, state-of-the-art appliances, and a central island where Margaret prepared elaborate meals during the day. Sophie opened the refrigerator, the cold light bathing her face, searching for... she didn't even know what. Something. Anything. Can't sleep? Sophie almost dropped the orange juice pitcher she had grabbed. She turned abruptly and found Daniel standing in the kitchen entrance. He wore only black cotton pajama pants, his torso completely bare. And what a torso! Sophie had to actively fight not to stare. His chest muscles were defined but not exaggerated, covered by a light layer of dark hair that descended in a trail down his marked abdomen. Broad shoulders, strong arms, bronzed skin looking golden under the kitchen's soft light. No. Sophie finally managed to speak, forcing her eyes to stay on his face. "You can't either." Daniel entered the kitchen, walking with that natural confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own body. He grabbed a glass from the cabinet, moving around her with deliberate proximity. When he reached for the juice pitcher in her hands, their fingers touched. They both froze. It was just a touch, skin against skin. But the electricity that passed between them was so intense that Sophie gasped. Daniel didn't immediately withdraw his hand. Instead, his fingers lightly traced over hers, a caress so subtle it could have been accidental, but they both knew it wasn't. "Sophie," he began, his voice rough, loaded. "Don't," she interrupted him, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Don't say this is wrong. Don't say it shouldn't be happening. I already know all that." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, as if being pulled by a force beyond his control, he raised his free hand and touched her face, his warm palm against Sophie's cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that brutally contrasted with the intensity in his eyes. "You're driving me crazy," he confessed in a hoarse whisper. "Every damn day, every time I see you, every time you pass by me and I smell your perfume, every time you look at me with those eyes." Sophie placed her own hand over his, pressing his palm more firmly against her face. Then stop running. I'm not running, Daniel argued, but there was a lack of conviction in his voice. You are, Sophie countered, taking another step closer until their bodies almost touched. You're terrified. Because if you allow yourself to feel this, if you allow yourself to want me, it means admitting you don't have as much control as you think you do. Daniel's eyes narrowed. His hands slid from her face to the nape of her neck, his fingers burying themselves in her loose hair. He pulled her closer, until there was no more space between them, until Sophie could feel the heat of his bare body radiating through the thin silk of her nightgown. You don't know anything about control, he murmured against her lips, his breath hot and irregular. You have no idea how much I have to hold back from... From what? Sophie challenged him. Her own breathing accelerated, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could feel it through the thin fabric between them. Daniel growled, a low, guttural sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest. Then, with a quick movement that took the air from Sophie's lungs, he turned her and pressed her against the kitchen's granite island, his body covering hers from behind. But he didn't kiss her. Not yet. Instead, his lips brushed her ear, his hot breath sending shivers down Sophie's entire spine. From doing this, he whispered, and then his mouth descended down her neck, depositing light, teasing kisses that made Sophie's legs tremble. Sophie let out a low, involuntary moan. Her hands gripped the edge of the granite counter, needing something to hold on to while sensations flooded her. Daniel's lips continued their descending trail, kissing the curve of her neck, the line of her exposed shoulder where the robe had slipped. His hands held her waist, firm but gentle, his thumbs tracing slow circles over the silk fabric. Daniel! Sophie gasped, turning her head slightly, searching for his lips. He turned her in his arms, finally looking at her face to face. His eyes were dark, pupils dilated, the grey almost black. His chest rose and fell rapidly, muscles tense as if he were fighting himself. If we do this, he began, his voice hoarse, there's no going back. Sophie raised her hand and touched his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw, brushing her thumb over his lips. Maybe I don't want to go back. Something broke inside Daniel. Sophie saw the exact moment the last barrier fell. He kissed her like a starving man, like someone who had deprived himself for too long and had finally lost the battle against his own will. His hands were everywhere at once, in her hair, on her face, down her back, pulling her impossibly closer. Sophie responded with equal fervor, her nails lightly scratching his bare back, feeling the muscles contract under her touch. She could feel everything, his heat, his strength, the desire that pulsed between them like something alive. When they finally separated, breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against hers, his eyes still closed. You're going to destroy me, he whispered, and there was as much fear as desire in those words. Or maybe I'll save you, Sophie responded softly. Daniel opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked as if seeing her for the first time. Maybe. He agreed, and there was a fragile hope in that single word. Then he kissed her again, softer this time, more promise than desperation. And when they finally separated, and each went to their own room, Sophie knew something fundamental had changed between them. The distance was closing, and there was no way to stop it anymore. The days following the encounter in the kitchen were different, subtly different but undeniably transformed. Daniel no longer ran away. His gazes lasted longer. His hands found excuses to touch, a touch on her arm when passing, fingers that lingered when handing her a coffee cup, a hand briefly placed on the small of her back when guiding her to the dining room. Sophie felt like she was living in two worlds simultaneously. During the day, when Margaret was around or when Daniel took work calls, they maintained a facade of formal politeness. But in stolen moments, an empty hallway, a glance across the dinner table, a chance encounter in the garden, the tension between them was palpable, almost suffocating in its intensity. One night, Sophie was sitting in the mansion's less formal living room, the one Margaret called the music room, because of the antique grand piano that dominated one corner. She didn't know how to play, but she liked being there, feeling the history embedded in the ivory keys yellowed by time. The dark green velvet curtains were open, revealing the garden bathed in moonlight. A fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the wood-paneled walls. Sophie wore a simple grey knit dress that hugged her curves discreetly but undeniably. Her feet were tucked beneath her in the reading chair, an open book in her lap that she'd been pretending to read for 20 minutes while her mind wandered to forbidden places. "You're thinking too loud." Daniel's voice made her look up abruptly. He stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a casualness that contrasted with the intensity in his eyes. He wore black-tailored pants and a navy blue shirt with the first buttons open, revealing the bronzed skin at the base of his neck. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. "How do you know I'm thinking?" Sophie asked, closing the book slowly. Daniel entered the room, each step deliberate, measured. "You do this thing with your eyebrow. You furrow it slightly when you're lost in thought." Sophie didn't know whether to be touched or concerned that he observed her so closely. "And you watch me that much?" "Constantly." The raw honesty in the response made Sophie's heart skip a beat. Daniel stopped in front of her, extending his hand in a silent invitation. Sophie looked at the offered hand, strong with long fingers, veins visible beneath the skin. Without saying a word, she placed her own hand in his. He pulled her up with surprising gentleness, but didn't let go. Instead, his fingers intertwined with hers, his palm warm and rough against hers. With his free hand, Daniel pressed play on the built-in sound system. Music began playing. Something classical, instrumental, a violin crying out a melody that was both sad and hopeful. "Dance with me." It wasn't a request. It was a need. Sophie let him pull her close, one of his hands holding hers, the other resting on the curve of her waist. She placed her free hand on his shoulder, feeling the muscles move beneath his shirt as they began moving to the slow rhythm of the music. They didn't speak. There was no need for words. The way their bodies fit together, perfectly, as if they'd been made for this, said everything. Daniel guided her with natural confidence, fluid movements that made Sophie feel like she was floating. But it wasn't just a dance. It was a silent conversation. Each step, each shared breath, each moment their eyes met and held. Everything communicated what words couldn't. "I want you. This scares me. But I can't stop." The music continued, and Daniel spun her gently before pulling her back, this time closer. So close that Sophie could feel his heart beating against hers. So close that their breaths mingled. So close it would be impossible not to notice the dark desire in his eyes. "Why did you avoid me for weeks?" Sophie finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After that night in the basement." "Why?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. His steps slowed until they were no longer dancing, just swaying slightly, locked together. "Because every time I look at you," he began, his voice hoarse, loaded with emotion, "I want to forget everything that keeps me from touching you." Sophie felt her chest tighten. "And what keeps you from it?" "Fear." The confession came out like a painful sigh. "Fear that this is real. Fear that it isn't. Fear of wanting you so much and discovering you're here only out of obligation." Sophie released his hand and raised both hands to hold his face, forcing him to look at her. "I'm not here out of obligation. Not anymore. Sophie." And there was so much conflict in that name. "Kiss me, Daniel," she asked, her voice firm despite her racing heart. "Stop fighting this. Fighting us." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Daniel just looked at her. Sophie could see the battle happening behind those grey eyes. Control versus desire, reason versus emotion, past versus future. Then desire won. Daniel kissed her with an intensity that stole all the air from her lungs. It wasn't gentle. It was pure need. His hands held her face as if she were the most precious thing in the world, fingers burying themselves in her hair, tilting her head to deepen the kiss. Sophie responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding from his face to his neck, to his shoulders, feeling the tense muscles beneath his shirt. She opened her mouth under his, allowing his tongue to find hers in a dance that was both new and strangely familiar. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate. Daniel guided her backward until her back touched the wood-paneled wall. He pressed his body against hers, letting her feel everything, the heat, the strength, the desire pulsing between them. Sophie gasped when his lips left her mouth to trace a burning path along her jaw, descending down her neck. She tilted her head back, giving him access, her hands gripping his back. "Daniel!" His name came out as a low, involuntary moan. He growled against her skin, a primal sound that made something tighten in Sophie's lower abdomen. His hands traveled along the sides of her body, tracing the curves through the thin fabric of the dress, stopping at her waist before sliding to her back, pulling her impossibly closer. "You have no idea," Daniel murmured against her neck between kisses. "How much I want you. How much I need you." Sophie held his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her. "Then have me." Daniel's eyes widened. She saw the shock, the desire, the fear all passing quickly through those stormy eyes. "Sophie, if we do this," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I know." She interrupted him gently. "I know what I'm asking, and I want it. I want you, Daniel, not out of obligation, not out of convenience. I simply want you." Something broke inside him. Sophie saw the exact moment the last resistance dissolved. Daniel kissed her again, but this time there was something different. It wasn't just desire, it was promise. It was surrender. It was the silent admission that there was no going back. He picked her up with an ease that made Sophie's heart race even more. She wrapped her legs around his waist, her arms around his neck while he carried her out of the music room, up the wide marble staircase, down the silent corridor, past her bedroom door, and straight into his room. The room Sophie had never entered, Daniel Blake's private sanctuary. He set her down beside the enormous bed, covered with dark sheets, down pillows, everything masculine and imposing like its owner. The curtains were open, allowing moonlight to enter and bathe everything in silver tones. Daniel held her face again, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "Are you sure?" Sophie covered his hands with hers. "More than I've ever been sure of anything in my life." And then, slowly, with a reverence that contrasted with the previous urgency, Daniel began to remove her dress. His fingers found the zipper at the back, lowering it inch by inch, his knuckles brushing the exposed skin, provoking shivers. The dress fell in a pool of fabric at Sophie's feet. Daniel stepped back slightly, his eyes traveling over every inch of her now exposed body, only in black lace lingerie. The way he looked at her, it wasn't just lust, it was admiration, it was reverence. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "So perfectly beautiful it hurts to look at you." Sophie felt her cheeks warm, but didn't look away. Instead, she raised her hands and began unbuttoning his shirt, trembling but determined fingers. One button at a time, revealing bronzed skin, defined muscles, the trail of dark hair descending down his abdomen. When the shirt finally fell, Sophie allowed herself to touch him. Open palms on his chest, feeling his heart beating wildly, fingers tracing the contours of muscles, exploring, memorizing. Daniel closed his eyes, his breathing coming out irregular. "Sophie!" "Shh!" She silenced him, rising on her toes to kiss him again. He picked her up again, laying her gently on the bed before covering her with his own body. His weight was delicious, comforting and exciting at the same time. Sophie ran her hands over his broad back, feeling the muscles move beneath his skin, descending to the waistband of his pants. "I can't. I'm not that man," Daniel suddenly whispered against her lips, pulling back slightly, the conflict returning to his eyes. Sophie held his face firmly. "But I wish you were. I wish you were the man who allows himself to feel, who allows himself to want, who allows himself to love." Daniel's eyes closed tightly, as if her words caused physical pain. "I don't know if I still know how." "Then let me teach you," Sophie whispered, pulling him back into her arms. And there, in the silvery darkness of his room, between kisses and touches and whispers, something began to heal in both of them. But not everything was destined to remain perfect, and fate still had cruel cards to play. The next morning dawned different. Sophie woke wrapped in sheets that smelled like Daniel, that intoxicating mix of expensive cologne, spices, and something essentially masculine that made her heart race. But the side of the bed next to her was empty, the sheets already cold to the touch. He had left early, as always, doctor, CEO, man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. But something had changed the night before. They hadn't crossed the final line. Daniel had pulled back at the last moment, internal conflict winning over desire. But the intimacy they shared, the kisses, the touches, the whispered confessions in the darkness, all of it had created a connection that couldn't be undone. Sophie spent the entire day in a state of nervous anticipation. Every sound made her jump, hoping it was Daniel returning. Each passing hour seemed to drag like an eternity. She tried to distract herself, read, walked through the gardens, helped Margaret in the kitchen, but nothing worked. Her mind kept returning to the previous night, to the feeling of his hands on her skin, to the taste of his lips, to the delicious weight of his body on hers. When the sun finally began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sophie made a decision. She wasn't going to wait anymore. She wasn't going to pretend she could go back to living as if nothing had happened between them. She took a long bath, letting the hot water relax her tense muscles, washed her hair with her lavender shampoo, applied scented lotion to her still damp skin, carefully chose her outfit, a simple midnight blue silk dress that floated around her thighs, thin straps on her shoulders, a neckline that suggested more than it revealed, left her hair loose, falling in natural waves over her shoulders. Minimal makeup, just a touch of color on her lips. When she went down for dinner, Margaret looked at her with a knowing but discreet smile. Mr. Blake called, said he'd be home later today, asked to leave his dinner warm. Sophie felt a pang of disappointment, but just nodded. Thank you, Margaret. She dined alone in the formal dining room, a vast space with a table that could easily accommodate 20 people, but which today seemed even emptier, with just her sitting at one end. The food was delicious, as always, but Sophie could barely taste it. Each bite was mechanical, automatic. After dinner, she went to the library, her refuge. She lit only a few lamps, creating soft, welcoming lighting, grabbed a random book from the shelves, curled up in one of the leather armchairs and tried to read. It didn't work. The words jumbled on the page. Her mind refused to concentrate on anything but Daniel. That's when she heard him. The front door opening. Firm footsteps in the entrance hall, his deep voice briefly conversing with Margaret. Sophie slowly closed the book, her heart already beating faster. She didn't move from the armchair, just waited. And then he appeared in the library doorway. Daniel stopped at the threshold, his tie loosened, his suit jacket casually draped over one shoulder. His eyes found her immediately, as if he knew exactly where she would be. For a long moment, neither spoke. They just looked at each other across the space separating them, a space that seemed both immense and insignificant. You waited for me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Sophie slowly set the book aside, not taking her eyes off his. Always. Something crossed Daniel's face, an emotion so intense it made Sophie's chest tighten. He dropped his jacket on a nearby chair and walked toward her with deliberate, measured steps. He stopped in front of the armchair where Sophie was sitting, looking down, his eyes dark and intense. Do you know what you're doing to me? I hope the same thing you're doing to me, Sophie replied, her voice coming out firmer than she felt. Daniel knelt in front of her, a gesture so unexpected, so vulnerable, that Sophie felt tears sting her eyes. He placed his hands on her knees, over the silk fabric of her dress, his palms warm, even through the fabric. I tried, he confessed, his voice hoarse. All day I tried to convince myself that yesterday was a mistake, that we could go back to living like before. And did you succeed? Sophie asked gently, already knowing the answer. Daniel gave a low laugh without humor. I couldn't think of anything but you, during surgeries, during meetings, during every damn second of the day. He raised his hands, sliding them up her arms until he held her face between his palms. You haunt me, Sophie. And I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse. Maybe it's both, Sophie whispered, covering his hands with hers. Daniel pulled her close until their faces were inches apart. I can't fight this anymore. Then don't fight. And he didn't fight. Daniel kissed her with a hunger that had been suppressed for too long. His hands left her face to travel over her body, tracing curves, memorizing every inch through the thin fabric. Sophie responded with equal intensity, her fingers burying themselves in his hair, pulling him closer, always closer. Without breaking the kiss, Daniel lifted her from the armchair, and Sophie immediately wrapped her legs around his waist. He carried her to the old leather sofa near the fireplace, a vintage piece comfortable that had already witnessed decades of history in that library. He laid her gently on the soft leather, covering her body with his. The weight was delicious, familiar now after the previous night. But this time there was something different. There was no hesitation, no conflict, only certainty. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked, propping himself on his elbows to look into her eyes. "Because if we start now, I won't be able to stop." Sophie raised her hands and began unbuttoning his shirt, fingers firm and determined. "I don't want you to stop." With trembling but determined fingers, she finished unbuttoning the shirt, pushing the fabric over his broad shoulders. Her hands explored his bare chest, defined muscles, warm skin, his heart beating wildly under her palm. Daniel briefly closed his eyes, as if her touch caused pain and pleasure at the same time. Then, with deliberately slow movements, he began unbuttoning her dress. His fingers traveled over the exposed skin, provoking shivers wherever they passed. "You're so beautiful," he murmured against her skin, depositing kisses along her collarbone, descending down the valley between her breasts. "So perfectly beautiful." Sophie involuntarily arched her back when his lips found a particularly sensitive spot. Her hands gripped his shoulders, her nails digging lightly into his skin. The dress finally fell, along with the rest of the barriers between them. Daniel explored her with reverent hands and worshipful lips, memorizing each curve, each sigh, each small tremor of pleasure. "You're what I never knew I needed," he whispered against her ear, his voice hoarse, loaded with emotion. Sophie turned her face to capture his lips in a deep kiss, pouring into that kiss everything she couldn't express in words. "I need you too. I want you too. Maybe I'm falling in love with you too." When they finally united, it was with a tenderness that contrasted with the previous urgency. Daniel moved slowly, looking into her eyes, allowing her to feel each movement, each sensation. Their hands were intertwined, fingers firmly locked, as if they were the only anchor in a stormy sea. Sophie. Her name left his lips like a prayer, like a confession, like a promise. She responded with his name, with breathless whispers of pleasure, with hands that traveled over his back, feeling the muscles move beneath his skin. The world reduced to just the two of them, to the heat of intertwined bodies, to the synchronized rhythm of breaths, to whispers exchanged in the library's dim light. When climax finally came, it was together, waves of pleasure that flooded them simultaneously, leaving them breathless, trembling, completely lost in each other. Afterward, Daniel pulled her into his arms, adjusting their bodies until they were perfectly fitted on the old sofa. He grabbed a blanket draped over the back and wrapped it around them both, creating a warm and safe cocoon. Sophie laid her head on his chest, listening to his still racing heart gradually begin to calm. Daniel's fingers traced lazy circles on her bare back, an absent but infinitely tender caress. "Stay here," he murmured against her hair. "Just a little longer." "I'm not going anywhere," Sophie replied softly, allowing her eyes to close. And there, wrapped in each other, with the fire crackling softly in the fireplace and the silence of the night enveloping them, they both finally found something they had been searching for their whole lives without knowing it. Peace. But peace, as Sophie would soon discover, was a fragile gift, and fate was already preparing the next blow. The weeks following that night in the library were the happiest of Sophie's life. She and Daniel had found a rhythm, not perfect, but theirs. He still left early for the hospital, but now woke Sophie with gentle kisses before leaving. He returned earlier when he could, and they dined together, talking about everything and nothing. They shared the same bed now, bodies intertwined during sleep, as if even unconscious they couldn't stay apart. Daniel had become a different man. He was still intense, still carried that aura of control and power, but there was a softness in him now that hadn't existed before. He smiled more, laughed at Sophie's jokes, held her hand while they walked through the gardens at dusk. And the love, God, the love. They hadn't said the words yet, but they were there, in every look, in every touch, in every stolen moment. Sophie felt it growing in her chest like a plant finding light after years in darkness. But then, something began to change. It started with morning sickness. Sophie would wake with her stomach churning, running to the bathroom before even fully opening her eyes. At first, she attributed it to nervousness, to the intense happiness that left her in a constant state of emotional excitement. Then came the sensitivity. Her breasts ached at the slightest touch. Smells she used to love, like the fresh coffee Margaret prepared every morning, now made her nauseous. Her body temperature seemed perpetually elevated, as if she were always slightly feverish. And the fatigue. God, the fatigue. Sophie, who had always been active, now found herself needing afternoon naps, struggling to keep her eyes open during dinner. Daniel noticed, of course. "Are you feeling okay?" he asked one morning, watching her push breakfast around her plate without actually eating. "You seem different." "I'm just a little tired." Sophie forced a smile. Maybe it's the changing weather, but she knew it wasn't the weather. Deep down in some primitive and instinctive place, she already knew the truth. But she was afraid to confirm it, afraid of what it would mean, afraid of how Daniel would react. It was Margaret who finally confronted her. "Dear, how long has it been since you had your period?" the older woman asked gently one afternoon, while Sophie helped her fold bedding in the laundry room. Sophie froze, a pillowcase halfway folded. I'm not sure." Margaret looked at her with those wise, kind eyes. "Have you thought about taking a test?" The test? Of course. How had she not thought of this before? Maybe because part of her didn't want to know, because confirming would mean facing a reality that could change everything. But Margaret was right. She needed to know. That afternoon, Margaret discreetly brought 3 drugstore pregnancy tests. Sophie held them in her trembling hands, the weight of the small boxes seeming disproportionate to their actual lightness. She locked herself in the bathroom of her suite, the one she barely used anymore since she spent every night in Daniel's room. Her hands trembled so much she almost dropped the first test while opening the package. She followed the instructions mechanically, waited through the longest minutes of her life, sitting on the edge of the Victorian tub, staring fixedly at the 3 plastic tests lined up on the marble sink. Single line, not pregnant. 2 lines, pregnant. Simple as that. Life could change with a single additional line. When the phone alarm rang indicating the time had passed, Sophie could barely stand up. Her legs felt like jelly. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. She approached the sink slowly, looked down. 2 lines, on all 3 tests. Clear, unmistakable, definitive. Pregnant. Sophie gripped the sink, her legs finally giving out. She slid to the cold floor, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to process the information she had just received. Pregnant. She was carrying Daniel's child. Emotions flooded her all at once. Fear, joy, panic, hope, love. So much emotion that she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. So she did both, sobs shaking her body while an insane smile sprouted on her lips. A baby. No. Wait. Sophie looked at the tests again, picking them up with trembling hands. Something bothered her. The intensity of the lines, the speed with which they had appeared. She grabbed her phone and, with still trembling fingers, searched. Read articles, forums, medical information. And then she found it. Exceptionally positive pregnancy tests, with very dark lines very early, can indicate multiple pregnancy. Elevated HCG levels, twins, or more. Twins. Oh God, twins. Sophie needed to confirm, needed to be sure. But she couldn't go to just any doctor. Daniel knew all the obstetricians in town. It would reach his ears before she even left the office. She used her phone to schedule an appointment with a private clinic in another city, paying out of pocket with the credit card her father had given her years ago that she rarely used. The appointment would be in 3 days. 3 days of carrying that secret. 3 days of trying to act normal while inside there was a storm of emotions. The night after the discovery, Sophie was lying in Daniel's arms, her head resting on his chest, listening to his heart beating in a constant, comforting rhythm. His fingers traced lazy circles on her bare back, a gesture that had become familiar, dear. "You're quiet today," Daniel murmured against her hair. "What are you thinking about?" "That I'm pregnant. That we're having twins. That my entire life just changed and you have no idea." "Just thinking about how everything has changed," Sophie replied, which wasn't a lie. "A few months ago I didn't even know you, and now—" "And now?" Daniel encouraged when she didn't complete the sentence. Sophie raised her face to look at him. In the soft light of the lamp he looked younger, more unguarded. There was so much tenderness in those eyes that used to be so cold. "And now I can't imagine my life without you." As she confessed, something passed across Daniel's face. He pulled her closer, kissing her forehead with a gentleness that made Sophie's heart tighten. "Me neither," he whispered. "Then maybe he'll be happy with the news. Maybe he wants this too." Sophie wanted to tell him in that moment, wanted to share the joy, the fear, the hope. But something held her back, something that said to wait, to be sure first. 3 days later, Sophie was sitting in a cold, impersonal exam room in a clinic 2 hours away. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and competent hands, applied the cold gel to Sophie's abdomen and moved the ultrasound transducer. "Let's see," the doctor murmured, eyes fixed on the screen. Sophie could barely breathe. Her eyes were glued to the monitor, trying to decipher the shadows and shapes that made no sense to her. Then the doctor stopped, smiled, pointed at the screen. "There they are." "They," Sophie whispered. "Twins," the doctor confirmed, pointing to 2 small pulsing dots. "See here, 2 gestational sacs, 2 strong, healthy heartbeats. Congratulations, dear. You're approximately 8 weeks along." 8 weeks. Twins. Heartbeats. Life. 2 lives growing inside her. Tears ran down Sophie's face, wetting the hair spread across the examination table. The doctor gently squeezed her hand. "Exciting, isn't it?" "Very." Sophie managed to say through the sobs. "Very exciting." The doctor printed several ultrasound images. Sophie held the photos with reverent hands the entire way home. 2 small spots in black and white, her babies, hers and Daniel's babies. She rehearsed 1,000 times how she would tell him, imagined his reaction, the initial shock, then the joy. He would pick her up in his arms, spin with her, kiss her still flat belly, and whisper promises to the babies. When she arrived at the mansion, it was already getting dark. Daniel's car was in the garage. He had come home early today. Perfect. Sophie would put the ultrasound images in a nice envelope, prepare a special dinner, and tell him. But when she entered through the back door that led to the kitchen, she heard voices coming from Daniel's office. The door was ajar, and she recognized the voice of Marcus, Daniel's best friend and business partner. Sophie was going to walk straight past, didn't want to interrupt, but then she heard her own name. "Sophie is a good girl, Dan, but don't you think all this happened too fast?" Sophie froze in the hallway, her heart racing. "I know." Daniel's voice tired. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm not making the same mistake as my father. He married out of obligation and spent his entire life miserable." The words hit Sophie like a shot to the chest. "Do you think you're miserable?" Marcus asked. A pause. A pause too long. Too cruel. "Not miserable," Daniel finally replied. "But complicated. My life was simpler before. More controlled. Sophie is too intense for me sometimes. She feels everything so deeply. And You're afraid you can't match it," Marcus completed. "Exactly." Sophie didn't hear anything more. The blood roaring in her ears drowned out any other words. She turned mechanically and climbed the stairs to the bedroom, not Daniel's but hers, the one that had been practically abandoned in recent weeks. She closed the door and slid to the floor, her back against the wood, the ultrasound images still clutched in her hand. "My life was simpler before. Sophie is too intense for me." She looked at the images, at the 2 small dots representing her children, Daniel's children, and made the hardest decision of her life. She couldn't stay. Couldn't raise her children in a place where she was seen as a complication, as something that made their father's life harder. Her babies deserved to be wanted, deserved to be loved, deserved more than being a complication. With trembling but determined hands, Sophie grabbed a suitcase from the closet and began packing. Only the essentials, clothes, some personal belongings, the ultrasound images carefully stored in her purse. She waited until late at night, when she was sure Daniel would be asleep. She wrote a letter. The words came out blurred by the tears falling on the paper. Daniel, I heard what you said today, about your life being simpler before me, about me being too intense. And you're right, I do feel everything deeply, maybe too deeply, but I can't change who I am. And you shouldn't have to live feeling suffocated. Thank you for teaching me that I could be loved, even if only for a moment. Thank you for making me feel alive. Take care of yourself, Sophie. She left the letter on his bed, along with the wedding ring she had removed from her finger with trembling hands. And then, in the silent darkness of dawn, Sophie Miller Blake left the mansion, the man she loved and the life she could have had. Alone, pregnant with twins, and heartbroken. 6 months had passed since Sophie left the Blake mansion. 6 months that seemed like a lifetime, and at the same time, just a blink of an eye. She had settled in a small coastal village 4 hours away, a place where no one knew her, where no one asked questions, where she could simply be Sophie, the pregnant woman who rented the small blue-painted wooden house overlooking the sea. The house was modest but welcoming. 2 bedrooms, a living room with a fireplace, a tiny but functional kitchen, and a wooden deck where Sophie spent hours watching the waves break on the beach. She had used the money her grandmother left her, a small inheritance but enough to start over. Her belly had grown considerably. At 7 months into a twin pregnancy, Sophie looked ready to burst. Her ankles were swollen, her back ached constantly, and sleeping was almost impossible. The babies seemed to have decided that nighttime was the best time to practice kung fu in her womb. But she was happy, or at least, she was learning to be. There was a midwife in the village, a woman named Ruth with grey hair and calloused hands that smelled of herbs and knew everything about babies. She visited Sophie weekly, checking the twins' heartbeats, measuring her belly, offering teas that promised to relieve swelling and nausea. "They're strong," Ruth always said with a smile. "A boy and a girl, you said?" "Yes," Sophie would reply, caressing her belly. "I found out at the last ultrasound before I moved. A boy and a girl. Perfect, healthy, hers." Sophie talked to them constantly, told stories while knitting tiny clothes, sang lullabies while rocking in the rocking chair she'd bought at a local thrift store, promised them that, even without a father present, there would never be a lack of love. Never. But the nights were hard. At night, when loneliness weighed like a damp blanket, Sophie allowed herself to think about Daniel. Imagined what it would have been like if he had known. If she had told him before running away, would he have been happy? Or would he have just confirmed her worst fears, that she and the babies were just complications in a life that was simpler without them? She cried sometimes, her hands on her belly, apologizing to the babies for depriving them of a father. But then she would feel a kick, strong, determined, as if they were saying it was okay, that they had her, and she would be enough. It was on a cold autumn morning, with the sea rough and the grey sky promising a storm, that everything changed. Sophie was on the deck, wrapped in a thick blanket, a cup of chamomile tea in her hands, when she heard the sound of a car stopping on the small dirt road in front of the house. She didn't even turn at first, probably Ruth with her old pickup truck coming for the weekly visit. But then she heard the car door slam, firm footsteps in the sand, climbing the wooden steps of the deck. And that voice that haunted her dreams and nightmares. Sophie. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a shout, it was just her name, but the way he said it, loaded with so much suffering, so much relief, so much raw emotion, made Sophie's heart stop. She turned slowly, the teacup almost falling from her trembling hands. Daniel Blake stood on the deck, but it wasn't the Daniel she remembered. This Daniel was thinner, much thinner. His cheekbones were more pronounced, dark shadows under the grey eyes suggesting sleepless nights. The stubble covered his jaw, something the meticulous and controlled Daniel she knew would never allow. His clothes, faded jeans and a dark sweater, were wrinkled as if he had slept in them. But it was the eyes that destroyed her. There was so much in those eyes: pain, desperation, relief, and something more. Something Sophie couldn't name, but that made her chest tighten painfully. For a long moment, neither spoke. They just looked at each other across the distance of a few meters that seemed like an unbridgeable chasm. Then Daniel's eyes descended from her face to her body, to the enormous belly, impossible to hide under the knit dress. Sophie saw the exact moment comprehension hit him, saw his eyes widen, saw his mouth open in shock, saw his legs waver as if they'd been cut. "Sophie," he whispered, his voice broken. You're pregnant." It wasn't a question, it was a stunned statement. Sophie forced herself to lift her chin to keep her voice steady, even with tears threatening to fall. "I am." Daniel took a stumbling step toward her, hands extended as if wanting to touch, but stopped halfway. Are they mine?" The question should have hurt, should have enraged Sophie. But she saw in his eyes that it wasn't an accusation, it was desperate hope. "That's a bold question for someone who let me leave," Sophie replied, her voice cold despite her racing heart. "I didn't let you leave," Daniel practically shouted, composure finally breaking. "You ran! You left me! I woke up and you were gone, Sophie, without explanation, just a letter saying I was better off without you." "You said your life was simpler before me," Sophie retorted, the tears finally flowing. "I heard you, Daniel. I heard you telling Marcus I was too intense, that everything was too complicated with me." Daniel ran his hands through his hair, pulling hard, frustration and desperation evident in every line of his body. "You heard a conversation out of context. You didn't stay to hear the rest, didn't hear when I said that despite the complication, despite the fear, I couldn't imagine my life without you. That you were the best thing that ever happened to me." Sophie shook her head, tears falling freely now. "But you said I was too intense." "You are intense," Daniel shouted, then took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. "You feel everything so deeply, Sophie. You love with such intensity it scares me, because I never had that, never knew how to reciprocate, and that terrified me." He took another step toward her, then another, until he was just a few feet away, so close that Sophie could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the new worry lines on his forehead. "Answer me one thing," Daniel asked, his voice hoarse. "Are they mine?" Sophie hesitated. Part of her wanted to hurt as she had been hurt, wanted to deny, wanted to make him suffer. But she couldn't lie. Not when he was looking at her that way. "Yes," she whispered. "They're yours." Daniel's legs failed. He literally fell to his knees before her, his hands trembling as they extended hesitantly toward her belly. "May I?" he asked, his voice broken. Sophie didn't trust her own voice, so she just nodded. With a reverence that took the air from Sophie's lungs, Daniel placed his palms on her belly. His hands were large enough to cover almost the entire expanse, warm even through the fabric of the dress. The moment he touched, one of the babies kicked, hard, directly against Daniel's palm. He gasped, his eyes widening in absolute wonder. I felt it. "They're active," Sophie said softly, unable to contain the small smile that sprouted despite the tears. "Especially at night." "They?" Daniel looked up at her, hope and fear mixed in his eyes. How many?" "Twins," Sophie revealed. "A boy and a girl." Daniel's reaction was immediate and visceral. He lowered his head, pressing his forehead against her belly, and Sophie felt the wetness of his tears soaking the dress. "Twins," he repeated, his voice muffled against her. "A boy and a girl. Sophie, I can't—" His voice failed. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. Sophie, unable to contain herself, ran her hands through his hair. It was longer than she remembered, more disheveled. Her nails traced his scalp gently, offering comfort, even when her own heart was shattered. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel finally managed to ask, still on his knees, still with his face pressed against the belly where his children were growing. "Why did you run without telling me? Because I was afraid, Sophie confessed. Afraid you'd see them as one more complication, one more thing making your life difficult. I can't raise our children in a place where they're not wanted. Daniel raised his head abruptly, his eyes red but burning with intensity. Not wanted? Sophie, I spent the last 6 months looking for you. 6 months of hell not knowing if you were okay, if you were alive, if I'd ever see you again. How did you find me? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hired private detectives, tracked movements on your credit card, investigated every clinic, every hospital within a 300-mile radius. Daniel slowly stood up, never taking his hands from her belly. And when I finally found a record of a Sophie Miller who had an ultrasound 6 months ago at a private clinic, I knew it was you. And I kept searching until I found this village, this house, you. He held her face between his palms, forcing her to look into his eyes. Forgive me, he pleaded, and there was so much sincerity in those words that Sophie's heart broke even more. Forgive me for not being clear, for letting you doubt what you felt for me. I was a coward, Sophie. I ran because I loved you too much, because I'd never loved anyone like this, and didn't know how to handle it. You love me? Sophie whispered, barely able to believe the words. Since the moment I lifted that veil and saw your eyes, Daniel confirmed. Maybe even before that. Maybe the moment fate decided you'd be at that altar instead of someone else. I love you, Sophie. I love you so much it hurts. I love you so much that these 6 months without you were a living hell. Sophie closed her eyes, tears running between his fingers, still holding her face. I love you too. So much. Even when I should have hated you, I still loved you. Daniel pulled her into his arms, or as much as he could with the huge belly between them. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe, his face buried in her hair, his body trembling. Let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that fate was right about you, he whispered against her ear. Let me be the father our children deserve. Let me be the man you deserve. Please, Sophie, give me one more chance. Sophie pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. She saw love, saw regret, saw promise, saw future. One chance. She finally agreed. But if you hurt me again? I won't, Daniel promised, sealing the vow with a kiss. Gentle, tender, loaded with promises. Never again. I swear on the lives of these 2 little ones. And there on the deck of the small blue house overlooking the sea, with the wind blowing and the storm approaching, 2 broken souls began to heal. Together, as they always should have been. Daniel didn't go back to the city. He simply stayed. In the days following the reunion, he settled into the small blue house as if he had always belonged there. He delegated his responsibilities at the hospital to his partners, transferred important meetings, reorganized his entire life around Sophie and the babies who were coming. You don't have to do this, Sophie said on the first morning, watching him prepare breakfast in the tiny kitchen. You have responsibilities, an empire to run. Daniel turned, spatula still in hand, and looked at her with an intensity that made her heart skip. My only responsibility now is to be here, with you, with them. He pointed to her belly. The rest can wait. And he was everywhere. When Sophie woke in the morning with back pain, Daniel was already there, massaging her tense muscles with the skilled hands of a surgeon. When her ankles swelled, he elevated her feet in his lap and massaged them gently, while reading medical articles about twin pregnancies. When the babies kicked too hard and Sophie winced in discomfort, he placed his hands on her belly and talked to them. Hey, you two, he would say in a soft voice. Be gentle with Mommy. She's working very hard to take care of you. And the babies seemed to listen to him. They always calmed down when Daniel spoke, as if they already recognized their father's voice. Sophie fell in love with him again every day, not with the controlled and distant CEO she had known, but with this man, barefoot in the kitchen making pancakes, hair disheveled, smiling while singing off-key songs to her belly. You're terrible at singing, Sophie would laugh, lying on the couch with her feet in his lap. The babies don't care. Daniel would respond with feigned dignity. They think Daddy is the best singer in the world. Daddy. The word made Sophie's heart melt every time. At night, they talked. About everything. About Daniel's difficult childhood with a father too demanding and a mother too absent. About Sophie's adolescence always trying to be invisible in a family that only valued Emma. About fears, hopes, dreams. "What are we going to name them?" Daniel asked one night, lying beside her in bed, his hand resting possessively on her belly. Sophie had thought about this a lot. "I thought Emma for the girl after my grandmother. She was the only person who loved me unconditionally when I was a child." "Emma." Daniel tested the name, smiled. "It's perfect. And the boy? I thought I'd let you choose," Sophie said softly. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He blinked quickly, trying to hide them, but Sophie saw. "Thomas. After my grandfather. He was the only person who believed in me when I said I wanted to be a doctor." "Emma and Thomas," Sophie repeated. "Our babies." Daniel kissed her then, long, deep, full of promises. It was 2 weeks later, on a full moon night with the sea rough outside, that everything changed. Sophie woke with a dull pain in her back. Nothing major. She was already used to pains. But then came another, stronger, radiating from her lower back to her abdomen. She gasped, her hand automatically going to her belly. Daniel woke instantly, medical instinct taking over. "What is it? What's happening?" "I don't know, a pain," Sophie breathed through the contraction. "But there are still 3 weeks until the due date." "Twins rarely wait for the due date." Daniel was already getting up, turning on the light, grabbing his phone. "How much time between contractions?" "I've only had one," Sophie began, but then another pain hit her, stronger. She screamed, gripping the sheet. Daniel timed it. 5 minutes. Damn! "Sophie, we need to get to the hospital now." "There's no hospital here, Daniel," Sophie said through the pain. "The nearest city is an hour away." "Then let's go." Daniel was already helping her up, grabbing the bag Sophie had prepared weeks ago. But when they reached the door, another contraction hit Sophie. So strong her legs gave out. Water gushed between her legs, soaking the wooden floor. "My water broke," she gasped. "Daniel, my water broke." Daniel picked her up in his arms, carrying her back to the bedroom. His face was pale, but medical training took control. "There won't be time to get to the hospital. I'm going to have to deliver here." "What?" Sophie screamed, another contraction tearing through her. You can do that." "I'm an obstetrician, Sophie," Daniel reminded her, already grabbing his phone. "I deliver babies every day. I just never imagined I'd be delivering my own children." He called Ruth, the midwife, who promised to arrive in 20 minutes. Then he called an ambulance, but with the storm that had started, it would take at least an hour. "It's okay," Daniel said, more to himself than to Sophie. "It's okay. We can do this." He prepared everything with impressive efficiency: clean sheets, towels, hot water, the emergency kit Ruth had left, washed his hands meticulously, put on sterile gloves. The contractions were coming every 2 minutes now. Sophie screamed with each one, gripping Daniel's hand hard enough to hurt. "You're doing great," he kept saying, kissing her sweaty forehead between contractions. "You're so strong, my love, so incredibly strong." Ruth arrived in the middle of a particularly strong contraction. She assessed the situation quickly, nodded to Daniel. "She's fully dilated. It's time to push." "I can't," Sophie cried, exhausted, terrified. "It's too early. What if something goes wrong? What if—" Daniel held her face with both hands, forcing her to look at him. "Look at me, Sophie. Only at me. You can do this. You're the strongest woman I know. And I'm here. I won't let anything happen to you or our babies. Trust me." Sophie looked into those grey eyes, steady, confident, full of love, and nodded. "I'm going to need you to push with the next contraction," Daniel instructed, getting into position. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Sophie whispered. The next contraction came like a wave. Sophie pushed with everything she had, screaming with the effort. That's it," Daniel encouraged. "I can see the head, dark hair, lots of hair." 3 contractions later, with one last desperate push, the first baby was born. Crying filled the small house, loud, strong, indignant. "It's the girl," Daniel announced, his voice broken with emotion. "Our Emma." Ruth quickly cleaned the baby, cut the cord, and placed her on Sophie's chest, small but perfect. Dark, wet hair, eyes closed, crying with all the strength of her tiny lungs. "Hello, my love," Sophie cried, kissing the little head. "Hello, Emma." But there was no time to rest. The second baby was coming. 2 contractions later, Thomas was born. Smaller than his sister, but equally perfect, equally healthy. His cry joined his sister's in a beautiful cacophony. Daniel held them, one baby in each arm, and Sophie had never seen anything as beautiful as that image. The man she loved barefoot in a sweater stained with blood and other fluids, holding their children with such gentleness, such reverence, with tears streaming freely down his face. "A boy and a girl," he whispered, amazed. "Perfect, so perfectly perfect, like you." Ruth finished taking care of Sophie, making sure everything was fine. The ambulance finally arrived, but it was no longer necessary. Mother and babies were healthy, small miracles born in a storm. After Ruth and the paramedics left, when everything was finally quiet, Daniel lay on the bed next to Sophie. Emma slept on her chest, Thomas in his arms. He pulled a blanket over all 4 of them, creating a warm and safe cocoon. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, kissing Sophie's hair. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving me them, for giving me a family." Sophie turned her head slightly to look at him. She saw love, saw gratitude, saw future. "Thank you for coming back," she replied, "for finding us, for staying." "Always," Daniel promised, looking at the sleeping faces of his children. "I'll stay always, no matter what." Emma grumbled in her sleep, her little fist gripping Sophie's shirt. Thomas yawned, a tiny sound that made both parents smile. "They're perfect," Sophie murmured, exhaustion finally taking over. "Just like their mother," Daniel agreed, depositing a soft kiss on her forehead. And there in the small blue house overlooking the sea, in a bed too full but perfectly cozy, a family was born. Not in the traditional way, not the easy way, but the right way. And that was all that mattered. The first months with newborn twins were a chaotic mix of diapers, bottles, sleepless nights, and a happiness so intense it sometimes hurt. Daniel and Sophie quickly learned that raising 2 babies at once required absolute teamwork. When Emma cried in the middle of the night, Daniel would pick her up while Sophie nursed Thomas. When Thomas had colic, Sophie would rock him while Daniel prepared bottles. They moved in perfect sync, like a dance only they knew the steps to. Daniel transformed the small blue house. He hired help to expand one of the rooms, creating a charming nursery with walls painted in soft mint green, mobiles with stars that glowed in the dark, and 2 small cribs side by side, because the twins slept better when they could feel each other's presence. But the most surprising thing for Sophie was seeing Daniel as a father. The cold and controlled CEO simply didn't exist anymore. This Daniel walked around the house at 3 in the morning with Thomas against his chest, singing off-key lullabies. This Daniel changed diapers with surgical efficiency while making funny voices for Emma. This Daniel cried openly when the babies smiled for the first time, when they held his finger with those tiny hands, when they looked at him as if he were the center of the universe. "I never thought I could love like this," he confessed one night, sitting in the rocking chair with Emma sleeping in one arm and Thomas in the other. "So much, so completely it scares me." Sophie, lying in bed watching them, felt her heart overflow. Welcome to the club. The months passed in a blur of firsts, first smiles, first laughs, first words. Dada for both, which made Daniel cry like a baby. First wobbly steps, with Emma determined to explore everything first, and Thomas more cautious, but equally curious. Daniel now divided his time between the house and the hospital. He had reorganized everything to work only 3 days a week, spending the rest of the time with his family. Marcus had taken on more responsibilities, and although the medical empire continued to prosper, Daniel had made it clear that his priorities had changed. "The career will always be there," he said, when Sophie asked if he didn't regret it. "But he pointed to the twins playing on the living room rug. "They're going to grow up in the blink of an eye, and I'm not going to miss a single second." It was on a spring afternoon, when the twins were almost a year old, that Daniel surprised Sophie. She was in the garden they had created together, full of wildflowers, lavender, and a small swing where she loved to push the babies. Emma was chasing butterflies with the determination of a hunter, while Thomas was trying to put grass in his mouth for the 10th time. Sophie. She turned and found Daniel standing there. He wore a simple white shirt and jeans, his hair slightly tousled by the wind. But what caught her attention was the expression on his face, nervous, hopeful, vulnerable. "What is it?" she asked, picking Thomas up before he could eat more grass. Daniel walked toward her, then did something completely unexpected. He knelt down. Sophie felt her heart stop. "We're already technically married," Daniel began, his voice trembling slightly. "Papers signed in a ceremony neither of us chose, but I want to do it right this time. I want it to be your choice. I want it to be love." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, opened it, revealing a ring, not ostentatious, not flashy, but perfect. A single stone that glowed softly in the sun. "Sophie Miller Blake, you taught me what love is. You showed me that being vulnerable isn't weakness. You gave me the two greatest gifts of my life." He looked at the twins, then back at her. "You saved me. Will you marry me? For real this time, for love, by choice, forever." Tears ran freely down Sophie's face. Thomas grumbled in her lap, confused by his mother's emotion. Emma stopped chasing butterflies to watch Daddy on his knees. "Yes," Sophie whispered. "1,000 times yes." Daniel slid the ring onto her finger with trembling hands. Then he stood and kissed her, soft, tender, full of promises and futures. Thomas got squished between them and protested with an indignant little scream, making them both laugh through their tears. Emma clapped, not fully understanding but sensing something important had happened. "Dada!" she shouted, running to hug Daniel's legs. He picked her up, balancing his daughter in one arm while the other remained around Sophie and Thomas. "My family," he said, looking at each of them as if they were the most precious treasures in the world. "My small and perfect family." The wedding happened 3 months later. It wasn't a large or ostentatious ceremony, just them, the twins, Ruth, Margaret, Marcus, and a few close friends. It was on the beach in front of the Blue House at sunset, with the waves providing the music and the wind carrying the promises. Sophie wore a simple white linen dress that floated in the breeze, her hair loose with flowers woven through, barefoot in the sand. Daniel wore light pants and a white shirt, equally barefoot. The twins, now a 1.5 years old, wore matching outfits, unsuccessfully trying to stay still in Margaret's arms. When it came time for the vows, Daniel held Sophie's hands and spoke from the heart. "The first time we married, it was obligation, scandal, convenience, but somewhere in the middle of the chaos, I found you. The woman who taught me that loving isn't losing control, it's finally finding it. Today I marry you by choice, for love, and I promise to spend every day of the rest of my life proving to you that you made the right choice." Sophie could barely speak through her tears. "You found me when I was lost. You loved me when I thought it was impossible to be loved. You gave me a family when I thought I was destined to be alone. Today, I choose you. Not out of obligation, not out of need, but because I can't imagine a single day without you." When they kissed, Emma and Thomas applauded along with all those present. The waves broke on the beach, the sun set in shades of orange and pink, and two souls that had started separate finally became truly one. 2 years later, life was gloriously chaotic. Emma was a stubborn and determined 3-year-old girl who loved books and insisted on wearing only purple dresses. Thomas was quieter, contemplative, with a special love for dinosaurs and helping Daddy in the garden. Daniel and Sophie had decided to stay in the coastal village. He opened a small community clinic where he saw patients for free twice a week, in addition to continuing remote consultations for the hospital. Sophie had started writing children's stories inspired by the twins' adventures, which were beginning to be published. The Blue House had been expanded to accommodate the growing family. A 3rd bedroom was added when Sophie discovered she was pregnant again, a sweet and unexpected surprise. One evening, Sophie stood on the deck watching Daniel play with the twins on the beach. He chased them while they screamed with joy, then picked them up, one in each arm, spinning until everyone was dizzy, and fell laughing in the sand. The scene made her smile, a big, genuine smile, full of pure happiness. Who would have thought that terrible night at the altar, being forced to marry a stranger in place of her sister, would lead to this, to a family, to love, to a future so bright that sometimes she needed to close her eyes against the intensity. Daniel looked up and saw her watching. He waved, the smile transforming his face, no longer the cold CEO, but the man she loved, the father of her children, her partner, her love. She waved back, her hand instinctively resting on her still flat belly where a new life was beginning. Daniel said something to the twins, who immediately ran toward the house. He followed them, picking both up in the last few meters and climbing the deck steps. "Mommy!" Emma shouted. "Daddy said we can have ice cream." "Only if you take a bath first," Sophie negotiated, kissing the sand-covered cheeks of both. Daniel set the children down and they ran inside, leaving trails of sand on the clean floor. He winced. "Margaret's going to kill me. You promised ice cream. You'll have to face the consequences." Sophie laughed. Daniel pulled her into his arms, his hands resting on her waist. "If this is complication," he murmured against her lips, "I want to complicate my life with you until the end." And he kissed her. Soft, slow, full of love and promises and futures. Inside, the twins were arguing about what flavor of ice cream they wanted. Margaret sighed loudly, seeing the sand on the floor. Life was noisy, chaotic, imperfect. But it was theirs, and it was absolutely perfect. Years later, when Emma and Thomas were adults, they would ask about how their parents met. And Sophie would tell the story, about a bride switched at the altar, about an arrogant CEO, about a storm that brought them together, about mistakes and forgiveness, and a love born from chaos. And they would understand that sometimes the best endings come from the worst beginnings, that sometimes the person you're forced to meet ends up being the one you would choose anyway, that sometimes complication is just another word for love, and that sometimes, just sometimes, fate gets it right. In the end, Sophie discovered that true love does not come from perfect beginnings, but from hearts willing to surrender. Daniel learned that strength does not lie in control, but in the vulnerability of giving oneself completely. Together, they transformed a forced marriage into a daily choice, a scandal into a love story, and two broken hearts into a whole family. Sometimes, fate gives us exactly the person we need when we least expect it. And perhaps deep down, this story also speaks to us about how the most beautiful endings are born from the most unlikely beginnings. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, click on the "Thanks a lot" button too. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us continue to bring you moving stories.